Hi again guys, and welcome to episode 41 of Days Gone By, the review series for Gran Turismo's classic and also some vintage cars. And this particular pick is for a vehicle which is probably easily thought of as more of a collector's piece, more of a novelty vehicle than a usable one, especially with regard to racing. And the thing about Volkswagen is they're pretty good at making cars like that. They make vehicles on the game in particular which aren't necessarily most people's first choice when it comes to racing, but people do seem to like them nonetheless, because they have this kind of slightly intangible collector's value. Stuff like the Beetle, the Type 2, the Kubelwagen, the Schrimmwagen, various other vehicles like that, which they're certainly not, as I said, most people's choice of, say, PP specific racer or seasonal event dominating machine, but many people do own at least some of those cars anyway, because there's just something about them which is endearing. And if you think about it in real life, Volkswagen has actually proved to be remarkably good at building cult classic vehicles. The Beetle is a cult classic. The Type 2 Samba Bus, which you can see here, which is extremely popular and probably even more so in camper van form. In fact, that vehicle is pretty much the definition of a cult favourite vehicle. You've also got stuff like the Kubelwagen, the Schrimmwagen, those Beetle-based vehicles, and although they're not necessarily cult classics, mainly because of how expensive they are, they did ultimately spawn vehicles which are still cult classics to this day, such as the Volkswagen Type 181, aka the Volkswagen Thing, which is based on the Kubelwagen, but it's got more of a hot rod kind of appearance to it, and I personally love that car. Now, this particular car, as I said, isn't the kind of vehicle which you'd think of as being a dominating track machine. That's just not what it was ever intended for. But can it be? That is the question, because some vehicles can be not necessarily problematic to tune, but you have to alter your methods, and a rear-engine, rear-wheel drive classic Volkswagen van is a perfect example of that. You cannot apply the same tuning methods to this vehicle that you would to, for instance, something like a TVR, or a Mazda MX-5, or a Cobra. Of course not, it's a totally different machine. You have to actually approach this car in more the way that you'd approach something like a Roof, for instance, which is of course also rear-engine, rear-wheel drive for the most part, and they actually share a lot of similarities. They have a lot of their weight over the back end, and that can result in a front end which not only doesn't have power going to it to correct it, as an all-wheel drive model would, but also has less weight, and as a result can have a bit of a shallow feeling to the steering. The front end can feel a bit loose, a bit wallowy, it can kind of float all over the road a little bit, and that can definitely happen with vehicles such as the Samba Bus. In fact, this is probably the perfect example of that. Now, as far as what you're looking at in terms of spec, you get actually some pretty good numbers given the car's age and intended purpose. Now, the car is pretty expensive given its performance. It's a 72 grand car, but it is a full premium, which kind of softens the blow a bit, and it is a nice car. It's relatively unique on the game, and the engine that you get in this vehicle is a 1.2 turbo. As we already said, it is rear-mounted, and fully tuned, you're looking at some pretty good numbers. In fact, it's actually got more power than the premium Beetle. 197 horsepower, and an even more impressive 296 foot-pounds of torque combined into a vehicle which weighs 920 kilos, which, given the physical size of the car, is very impressive. The car takes up a lot of real estate in terms of its size, but if you actually consider what's inside the car, it's basically a big empty can. There's not much weight to it at all. It's just a big looking vehicle, whereas with something like a Dodge Ram or a Jay Leno tank car or a Bentley, for instance, not that we have those on the game apart from the Le Mans car, they are chock full of equipment, completely packed out, and that's why they're so heavy. The Veyron as well is a perfect example of that, whereas with this car, like most vans, it's big, but it's not dense. It's a very shallow vehicle. It's mostly empty inside. And that combination of power and weight gives you a decent enough horsepower per tonne ratio of 214, which isn't going to rock anyone's world, but it's a Volkswagen Samba Bus from 1962, what do you expect? As far as the fully tuned PP, I would say this is actually remarkably good, because it's only 425, and that is ultra low for a car with nearly 200 horsepower that weighs not much more than 900 kilos. Those are some really good numbers. But it can still have tricky handling. Now, in a straight line, it's a pretty quick car, so you don't really need to worry about that, especially not right down at 425 pp. But the handling, well, you kind of need that to be good if it's going to be a useful vehicle, and happily you can actually make that the case. In fact, if you tune the differential of this car in particular in the right way, this can actually become something of a track monster. Of course, comparatively to such a low PP, it can be a pretty dominating force, I would say, at the 425 pp level. I'm not going to say that it's the most dominating vehicle at that level, because there are probably other vehicles which could be even better, but I will say it's a very good car at that pp level. Now, as far as the handling, we don't usually cover tuning in these reviews, but seeing as we're probably not going to do a dedicated tune for a car like this anytime soon, I will say that if you want to use your Samba Bus as a track car and you need to bring the handling under control, you can basically do whatever you want with most of the settings, but I would recommend diff settings of 30 on initial torque and with the acceleration and braking as low as possible. If you do that to your Samba Bus, you may well be shocked by how good it can be. So it's not a car for everyone, but I would recommend giving this car a chance. But that's it overall for this pick. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.